Good morning and welcome to the Committee of the Whole for the District of Squamish, Tuesday, May 14th, 2019. Welcome Squam, Quisquelecta, Classical Homish Awayame. Welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. I'm Councillor Doug Race. I'm the acting mayor this month and I will be chairing these meetings in the absence of Mayor Elliott, who is away on municipal business. First, I'd like a motion to adopt the agenda. Councillor French, second by Councillor Herford. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. We have 3 delegations this morning. First is the Squamish Turtle Trail Community Forest. Ms. Phelps.
It's not actually a community forest, it's a community
project, sorry. Well, I'll put my glasses
project.
on.
Yeah, I'll need my glasses too, but thank you. I first thought I wanted to say thank you very much to Council. I know you've got a very full agenda and I appreciate the opportunity of coming and updating you on the trail. First of all, this trail is actually, the intention of this trail is to build social capital in the community, to build relationships. First and foremost, second, third, and fourth. Ultimately, it will be feeding into our tourism sector as well, but that is absolutely not the intention of it, and I do really want to make that very plain to you. And that's always been the intention of this trail, by the way. So I would like to do a brief introduction and then a project overview. It'll be more Cole's notes. And then I really do want to get to the proposed interpretation, community interpretation trail. And it's a very high level concept. I would like to see if this council will support this concept and trail, not only the entire thing, the way previous councils have, and also if you are in agreement that we can use the trail itself as a vehicle, as a foundation for community interpretation, for getting to know each other. So with that, let's just move on to the next one. Maybe could we have the lights down just a little bit? Is that possible?
Yes.
Yeah. The Turtle Trail is bounded by the Squamish River, the Mamquam River, Loggers Creek, and Howe Sound. It is a circle loop, and that'll be important a number of times through this conversation. It's about 14 kilometers long. It is flat. It is family friendly. If we look, can I do this? It's just verbally described, it's easier. I'm assuming that people know where the Adventure Center is. It is the block that is lowest down and to the left. The intention of the trail is to connect by a trail, to get people out of their cars and to connect community nodes by trail. So if we go around the circle starting at the Adventure Center, we come to the brew pub, go around a little bit farther, we come to the Sikh Temple, go around a little bit farther, we come to the Railway Heritage Park, and farther again, we come to Brennan Park. So that's 5 major nodes that are destinations in their own right currently. They're existing. I want to go around the circle one more time. By the Adventure Center, we have access to the Smoke Bluffs Park. At the brew pub, we've got access to the oceanfront lands, and I call it the Turtle Head. When we move around to the Sikh Temple, we've got access to the estuary and the WMA. Further around at the Railway Heritage Park, we have access to the confluence of the Squamish and the Mamquam, the fishing area there, and also access to the Spit and the wind sports. Around again, another click of the turn, and we actually have access to the Mamquam Spawning Channel Trail. So that's again another 5. And if you can kind of keep these in the back of your mind, when we get to the interpretive plan, these will be important when we get there. That being said, let's move on to the next slide and let's look at the overall project and where are we. The completion of this project is represented by the turtle. Now, for those of you who are not turtle friendly necessarily, you can also picture this as a building and look at the foundation of the building and then several floors and then covered by a roof. I do turtles because that's the name of the project, and you can see it's pretty impressive color-wise. So let's start at the bottom and the physical trail. The district in 2016 did a feasibility study, which was great work, and the engineering department did that, and this will be available to you somewhere online, I'm sure. So where are we now with respect to the physical trail? The section between through Rose Park has been paved, and underneath the overpass, there has been real improvements made on that in terms of rideability, friendliness. It's part of the Safe Routes to School, so these are multiple uses and reasons why this has been improved, but it's part of the Turtle Trail as well. When we look at the Mamquam Blind Channel section, currently it's flagged along Loggers Lane, but as you know, the development is happening on the Blind Channel, and at some point in the hopefully not too distant future, we will be able to route that down the new trail on the Mamquam Blind Channel. Let me go across to last year, actually 2019. The district, this was the Parks and Trails people, in conjunction with operations, improved the section of trail in between the Sikh Temple and Castle Rock. And that was done, a joint project to improve the drainage with operations interests and also the Parks and Trails to improve the connectivity through there. There is an ask that was submitted last year, 2018, for the 2019 budget. The one outstanding section of trail which is problematic to ride as a pleasurable ride is the section between the Fisherman's Entrance through to the Railway Heritage Park. That was surfaced when the work was done with non-consolidating basalt rock, and it's not a good ride. And that's verified by a whole bunch of people. So I'm hoping that it'll be on the work plan for this year, that we'll actually be able to resurface that. And if not this year, maybe next year. So who knows? There's no timeline on this in particular. It is a community project. So that's kind of the physical trail. And if there's other questions, maybe we can talk about those a little bit later. I just kind of want to blow through this. The district also, and again, I think it was about 2016, invested in the wayfinding project again. And there's been 2 years of rollout on this, and this year it's on hold, is my understanding of where we are with that. The Trail Society has been flagging using our little blue markers. In between what the district has with the wayfinding project and what we're doing, there is a gap. So how do we look at urban trails? How do we mark those appropriately? Do we use what I think is more a rural standard for that, or do we actually want to do something else? My hope is that the work that the district is doing with the Squamish Little Bit Regional District, looking at signing wayfinding for the Corridor Trail, which is also the Sea to Sky Trail, which is also the Canada Trail, that we will be able to parse out some of those gaps and actually figure out how do we want to look at alternate routes and sign them. How do we want to do these other trails? So I'm hoping that we'll be able to move this forward this summer. Before we get to the storytelling, which is the main bulk of my presentation, I want to do promotion and communications briefly. The first thing is that there's no website, but there is a Facebook page, Squamish Turtle Trail. And that is a pretty casual updating, basically, of where we are and a history of the project as well. There is a brochure and map that was funded by the Squamish Community Foundation. And there's copies of that here in the brochure rack and also at Brennan Park. There's some good information, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. The third part that I wanted to bring up is the community crawl, and this has been going on for about 3 years, and this is the schedule for this year. And everybody in the community council staff is invited to partake of these should you wish. It's really an opportunity to network with the community and do some market research. We've got really valuable feedback by mums and kids, by people who are walking groups, all kinds of people, and that will continue, and that feedback comes back in asks and informs the asks for council or other groups, Trail Society, that kind of thing. This year we're making this a little bit different. There will be 3 ride-arounds on the Turtle Trail. There'll be 2 that are exploring the Corridor Trail, the Sea to Sky Trail. So we'll actually be starting the Corridor Trail rides at Brennan Park, and one of them will ride north. We'll see if we get as far as Sunwolf or not, and just kind of parse out where is that route, how does it work. The second ride will go south and go from, again, Brennan Park down to the gondola, and again, check out that route to raise the profile in the community and say, what do we need to do to make this really high profile in the community? So that will be available as well to you. Okay, so the major thing I wanted to talk about is storytelling. And this is new. This has not been presented to any council before. It's only gone to Trail Society and one of the committees of council prior to the election. We all know that we're living in a very interesting world, a very diverse, changing world, and Squamish is no different. Squamish has many dimensions to it, many interests, and I want to quote the mayor, who said previously that relationships, getting to know each other has to be a critical part of developing the community. And so this is what we're trying to do here, to actually bring together as many different sectors and interests in the community so that everybody can see reflected in this trail cycle some elements of themselves. It is very ambitious. I also wanted to say that the seed for this concept came from a meeting in 2012 at Totem Hall. And this was a Truth and Reconciliation Bright New Dawn gathering, 2-day gathering. There were 80 people in a sharing circle. Anybody who's had an opportunity to participate in that, it's a pretty powerful experience where nobody is more important than anybody else in the circle and everybody has a chance to speak. And it's a real listening exercise because we listen to everybody else in the circle. Obviously, with, I don't know, what are we at, 25,000 people, you can't have everybody in a sharing circle. But what we can try and do is actually reflect the diversity and the many dimensions of our community as a gateway, as a mirror of our community. And that is the intention of the trail. So let's get with it. This is probably pretty hard to see, I don't know, thank you. Okay, so let's have a look. On the left-hand side, do you remember those 5? There's the different kiosks, the different locations. Squamish Adventure Center, Howe Sound Brew Pub, the Sikh Temple, the Railway Heritage Park, and Brennan Park. Across the top, we've got columns, and I've numbered them sort of 1 to 8, so that we have a look, well, basically so we do an overview of what's the community all about. How much or how little that we can build, or what the timelines are, costing, that kind of stuff, will depend to a large extent on what are we looking at with respect to the kiosks and kiosk design. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'd like to lay before you this idea, this concept. On the right-hand side, you can see again that other 5 that we talked about: Smoke Bluffs, Oceanfront, Estuary Trails, Windsport Fishing, and the Spawning Channel Trails. I've put on column 7, I have put a question mark because there's loads of other things that we might choose to put in there. This is a very human-centric interpretive plan, but there's all the natural history. I don't know, maybe it would work, maybe it wouldn't. There's young people and the burden of anxiety they're bearing right at the moment, which reflects again what the community, and there'll be a project coming, I hope, to council that's actually looking at some of those. Or we might choose to do a map of the district, sort of from the gondola up to the fish hatchery and Quest University to the Spit, and not as here's how you get to all these locations, but rather, how is the valley put together? What are the different nodes and interesting places? We may choose to do something like that right down that column. Enough said. The next to the moving in a leftward direction here is the Squamish Turtle Trail. And again, I'm suggesting that we need to have information on why the turtle trail and that kind of all the different details that come in that, as well as the map, and that will be based on the brochure. The next column is Squamish Nation. Flavor of the month, the year, who knows, is Truth and Reconciliation. And this is an opportunity, I think, to build, not looking simply at the residential school story, but looking more at what was the culture like? What are the things to spark our imagination? And again, this is not my story, this is not our story. I will say that this project in earlier versions has gone before the Squamish Nation elders, and the brochure as well has gone through Squamish Nation education, and they have had a look at the translation of the names in the brochure, which are presented both in English and in Coast Salish as well. So lots of work to do on that. This is not my story, as I say. Because I worked with Squamish Nation education back in the mid-90s, I do have some ideas as starting points only when we worked on the Eagle Watch site, actually. So there's some ideas and stuff that may be appropriate, and again, may be totally off the mark. So let's move over to the next, what I've labeled Theme 1 and Theme 2, and this is going to change all the way around the circle. So at the Squamish Adventure Centre, it seemed to me logical that we look at outdoor recreation and we look at forestry as major themes for those areas. Going around the circle, when we look at House Sound Inn and Brewing Company, it looks like, I think of hops and the history of hops in terms of growing hops and all the economics around that. But I also think about the food security interests in terms of how do we feed ourselves, how will we feed ourselves in the future. So there's a whole lot of things I think that we can unpack looking there. Not only do gardens and farming and that kind of stuff feed us, but so does business. There was years ago, not that many years ago, there was a brochure that said forestry feeds our family. It still does, and for a lot of families in Squamish. But business does too. And so this is perhaps an opportunity to unpack and look at the business community. How we do that, I have no idea. But again, the brew pub is a business as well. So let's click around as well. If the brew pub was looking at how do we feed ourselves, the next at the Sikh temple is what is belonging. Yeah. And looking at the different waves of immigrants to the community, and just to see if we're paying attention. Does anybody want to hazard a guess on how many languages are spoken at home in Squamish? This is from Vital Signs, which I'm assuming is based on the census, and it says 50 languages. That's amazing. These are 50 languages, these are 50 cultures, these are 50 windows and connections and communications with the rest of the world. This is quite extraordinary, and how can we present that kind of diversity in the community in a sign? Again, I have no idea, but it's worth thinking about. The other thing is, okay, if that's what makes us different and makes us interesting, then what do we have in common? And I'm thinking about maybe the volunteer sector, maybe the schools, maybe this is a place where we start unpacking a little bit the residential school story in comparison with what was it before? What was their education before? So this may be an opportunity here. Let's click around the circle again. Let's look at the Railway Heritage Park. Transportation is what comes to mind. And again, we are a port here. And what I think it's interesting to contemplate, what did it look like when Squamish Nation used to pack up the community and go down to the fishing camps? What did it look like on the Sound? Is this a story that's worth exploring a little bit, that's worth presenting? I don't know. When we look at transportation and the role of Squamish in the larger transportation sector, the companion piece to that is communication. And we are living in perhaps the greatest transformation communication-wise since Gutenberg invented the printing press. It's an astonishing time that we're living in. And we know what's happening around the world, but the companion to that is the world knows what's happening in Squamish. And this is really interesting to me, and how do we go about exploring that and presenting that? Again, I don't know, but maybe it's worth having a look at. Let's go around a little bit more, and we'll look at the next issue at Brennan Park is governance. And this is something that you are involved in and are interested in, but there's a lot of people who really don't know that much about how do we govern ourselves? You know, what are the different levels of government? How does First Nations, what are their traditions? What is the role of the hereditary chiefs? I remember back in the day, mid-90s again, Harold Calla, who was elected councillor for Squamish Nation, and he said, you guys have a problem figuring out where First Nations with these overlapping jurisdictions and territories are, and how do we function? He asked us, have you ever had a look at your jurisdictions? Your forestry district does not line up with your hospital district, does not line up with your education district, does not line up with your regional district, does not line up, and it goes on and on and on. I thought, interesting. Yeah, maybe we do need to unpack some of those for ourselves and also for the community. So, this is again an overall framework. This is suggestions. There's a whole lot of work that we need to do on this in terms of talking to the community, individually, collectively. This is a very interesting cross-section of community sitting around this table. And while I don't want any commitment to budget or any of that, I would love to have, some feedback, not necessarily formally, but informally about, is this a good way of proceeding and how do we do that? So that's one more. I'm almost out of time.
And I did want to leave time for some questions and comments.
I'm just gonna stream through this. There's some possibilities. We could do just 2 columns. We could do 4 columns. There's a expensive version and a less expensive version here. This is possibly 2 columns. If we did both sides, that could be possibly 4. This is the 3-column format, BC Parks. This is Squamish Nation, and again, this is a wonderfully designed, and a very expensive. They were dealing with a timeline, the Olympics, they wanted to have it built, but we don't have to. We could do not that format, but we could actually look at a community project, and are there groups in the community that would be interested in designing and building it? The men's shed comes to interest, those kind of things, and that's why I included the little photograph of the Eagle Shelter, because that was a community project that was done with a lot of volunteer, and so that's it. Sorry, it's so much. It's not a tiny project, is what I'm saying.
It's a council. Comments or questions?
Thanks so much for the presentation and the overview of all the work that's been done to date and what still needs to be done. I think it's a really, really interesting project. I think the first and foremost, it being about building social capital is so critical in where we're at in terms of community building. So thank you for that. In terms of feedback specifically for the presentation components and the communication pieces, I like the direction that it's going. It's obviously very early stages and there's so many questions that came up. But I am excited that there is going to be some sort of narrative format along the way. I think that is a really important way to try and start telling some of the stories of our community. So I appreciate the direction it's going and happy to provide feedback as you continue to progress along the way. My question is, who leads this? It's obviously you are at the forefront of it. Who else is around the table?
There's been many presentations, going back, I don't know, 4 or 5 years kind of thing. I am the main push of this right at the moment, but the Trail Society is actively involved because we've been dealing primarily with the physical trail. And then the wayfinding, well, that's kind of hard to know exactly who's doing that piece of it. I have talked to the Historical Society, I have talked to the Forestry Society, I've talked to the Environment Society. There'll be ongoing conversations, that will need to be built in. I'm not in a panic and rush to do that portion of it, simply because we've got a long way to go, I think, looking at simply the physical trail and the wayfinding portion. So we'll have some time to actually build the rest of this. And my plan is actually to take some of this presentation after some of the work is done and actually produce a document, that I can come back to council with, and we can have a look at that, which is more a proposal, at which point then it'll be, in quotes, shovel ready, and then we can start talking about funding and looking at funding sources, that kind of thing, is what I think would work.
And a quick follow-up, you mentioned the section between Fisherman's Access and the Railway Museum needing a little bit of help. Are there other components of the physical trail that are kind of priorities at the moment?
No.
Councillor French.
So just in terms of feedback, 2 thumbs up to all of your thoughts around community relationships, storytelling. That's like that trail and the other trails around our community. That's where life happens in my life. That's where the real magic is. Are you envisioning at some point that the District of Squamish would somehow become the lead agency on the project, or aspects of the project, portions of the project?
Well, the physical trail, the district has to be involved in that because there's land ownership issues, there's development issues. I certainly cannot deal with CN. I think the district has difficulties themselves doing that too. What I would like to make sure is that the balance is maintained between government, between nonprofits, so that it's not one portion of the community's project. This is not my project. This has been before 2 other councils. So if this is going to have legs and work, and why would it not, then it has to have buy-in on an ongoing basis by the community. So obviously, the district will play an active role in the wayfinding because that's part of the mandate. The interpretive, that's going to be an interesting question, and the answer is I don't know. And I don't know the formation of a committee and a process. Again, when you think about what you did with the OCP process kind of thing, this is not going to be as formal, not timelines, but we've got a similar kind of thing. How do we bring the community together to talk about what best reflects? And then the other piece is, how do we make sure that the signs themselves are created to a standard, so that it actually functions? And my thought is that while there are people around who've done signs in the community, Patty Heinzman is one, Eric is another, I'm another, that probably having somebody from outside actually moderating, doing that, running interference in the community is probably a better idea.
Councillor Pettengill, then Councillor Anderson.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate, just with so much coming at us, it's hard to keep on
Yep.
top of all the events. So if we're a week or 2 out from the next walk or ride around town, I would love an email just reminding me of that, because I'd love to hear more about this in the context of actually being there. The one thing I wanted to ask about, and I may get the words wrong, but I think you said this is definitely not a tourism thing. Is that because you don't think there's the capacity there, or you just don't want sort of a tourism focus to dilute the community focus, or is it something else? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. The actual signs would be quite different if we're talking to ourselves compared to we're actually looking at a larger market. So I think it's really an important distinction that we actually look at this not primarily as a tourism attraction, it will become that, but rather as a community building exercise. And I think that that needs to be spoken up front, because quite often we look for economic opportunities, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this particular project, I would like to see maintain its focus as community building, as us talking to ourselves. Other people will be interested in that. But does that answer your question? Yeah.
Councillor Anderson, Herford, I'll put myself on the list, and I think that'll have to wrap it up.
I'd like to make two recommendations. I think that the recommendation that the council made in November 2016 was very sound, that this is a project that council should be updated on annually, at least annually. The Binney report that you've referred to discussed this as having a worthy of destination status. I think the last council saw this, and I would agree myself. I'd just like to note, my next other recommendation would be I'd like to see because this initiative was prior to the active transportation plan, which was adopted, a year, 18 months ago, I think that we need to have a better feel of how they overlap. This mini report is dense with technical recommendations and budgeting. And finally, I'll just note the overlapping and integration, or desirable integration, with other initiatives, including district wayfinding signage. That's a project ongoing for which there isn't a budget to complete yet. There's lots of to-dos in the district's own wayfinding report. Thank you.
That's why I waived that. I brought it.
The Marine Action Strategy has a specific recommendation on a planning for interpretive initiative on the waterfront. There are nonprofit groups and developers, of course, that are doing work already, and you've noted some of them. And all of them, I don't think there's any one of those projects that does not include reference to or collaboration with the Squamish Nation. Public art is another potential collaboration conversation, ongoing, but could be strengthened. And the Trails Master Plan, I noted with interest your observation on the trail surfacing. There's another integration and sharing of information. And I'll just leave it at that. So there are a number of parallel
There wasn't
points
enough
tied
time.
together.
Thank you. Councillor Herford.
Thank you. Thank you so much for ongoing work on this. I think it's amazing. I use portions of this trail regularly, and the sort of cross section of community I see using what's there already is amazing. I'd love to have to support ways that we can foster that. I really like the wayfinding and the interpretive signage are very important pieces of that, because if you don't know, and not everyone's comfortable kind of getting lost along the way, which I think it's great. And ideas for the interpretive signage and the kiosks and the locations all makes a lot of sense to me, but it's even stimulated a lot of thought, I know, in this room, so I'm sure if those are done right, we can just further the discussions that we all need to be having. I like the collaboration where there's opportunity, where we're improving something, some sort of infrastructure along the way, and we're able to improve the trail. That's great. And I understand there's a bit of a miss with the top surface of the dike there in that section, but hopefully that's a learning process, and we're just actually making things better in all the layers of that as we go forward. And I'm happy to hear about the corridor trail, City Sky Trail inclusion in this discussion, because those things can all link, and they're great resources that people don't really know about. They're really underutilized. So yeah, that utilization and sort of ties in with the level of support that we're having. This thing's being used a lot. We should be supporting it more so that they kind of play off each other. And I think we're really going in the right direction. So thank you so much for that.
And thank you again, Meg, for coming before us and the work you've done on this. I've given you positive feedback in this trail before. I'm not going to repeat that. But the part that was new to me today, and I think to the others, was the interpretive component. And I think that would be a great thing to aspire to. We are in a very rapidly growing community. There's a lot of new people coming into the community, connecting with the community for them, and the community connecting with them is a challenge, and this is one of the things I think that will help overcome that challenge. So I would absolutely support that. And I expect there will be ongoing conversations about how we might actually put that into place.
I honestly hope that people will take advantage of coming out and having a chance to really chit-chat in an informal situation on some of these rides and stuff. Or if council would like, and staff, like a time and place kind of thing, I'm totally happy to go, and we'll do a little separate one other than the public one.
Sure.
Up to you. Yeah. Thank you.
But thank you very much. Next on the agenda, number 2, Cannabis Cultivators and Local Zoning Bylaws. Ms. Chapelle.
Hello, all of you. Thank you for having me. It's strange to be in this seat. So I'm going to be presenting on cannabis cultivation and basically on economic development and the craft culture that's started to evolve in Squamish. And I know it's council's priority basically to help local businesses and entrepreneurs. So I wanted to present to you on the opportunity of cannabis. And fortunately, this economy has been thriving in Squamish for years. And it is basically just helping with your new zoning bylaw in order to celebrate the craft economy in the way that it's already being celebrated by the public and by tourism throughout Squamish. I also want to help you with the integration of regulations. You'll see in the press quite a lot, the federal regulations, the provincial regulations, Health Canada's regulations, but what this means to municipality has been left out. It's been left out of the didactic and the conversation. It's also been left out of the funding model. Municipalities do not have a revenue share from the provincial or the federal taxation. So these conversations need to be vocalized by all councils to make sure that municipalities who bear the brunt of having cannabis in their communities and the bylaws to have a revenue share from the province and the feds so that they can actually afford to be able to support the cannabis culture and the economy. So basically, the evolution of the regulations in Squamish and in all our municipalities has been from the MMAR, which is Medical Marijuana Access Regulations, to the for access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations, which is the ACMPR regulations. And this is all transcribed into the Cannabis Act now. So the Cannabis Act basically covers all the regulations for how cannabis is in our communities from the province and the feds. This is the breakdown, and I assume that you guys all have it in your agendas, the breakdown of federal, provincial, and municipal responsibilities. And you can see that the list for municipal responsibilities is quite extensive. And the one that I will be speaking to most today will be the zoning aspect of cannabis. Regulations, as you know, cannabis is a newly regulated economy, and it's a really interesting thing because when alcohol left prohibition, it experienced the exact same difficulties as cannabis is experiencing now without the social media, the communication, and the advocacy. We had large companies. The very first thing that happened with alcohol is the large producers wanted to keep the small producers out. So they went to the regulators at the time to keep the small producers out. And it wasn't until very recently that alcohol, basically, that you could go into a tasting room and taste wine, or go to alcohol tourism, or go to a brew pub and actually taste the beer that you're brewing in the back. This is all very recent, and it's because of a large lobby of craft producers that went to the legislatures. The new Health Canada regulatory process just happened last week. It means that any craft producer or any producer that is applying for a license must have a completed building and a fully built site. They have to have their security in place, their quality assurance professionals in place. They have to have it municipally inspected and approved, and then they can apply to Health Canada with their SOP. The micro cultivation license was also separated out from the massive license producer regulations. It's limited to 200, basically around 200 square meters of growth canopy. The growing cannabis plant until they flower and harvest. They can also apply for a separate license at the same time for production, but for extraction and for making it into a full product. But basically with the one license of a micro license, they can have a very small building. The footprint is basically around 4,000 to 6,000 square feet. And then you can run a micro processing plant.
So is this indoor or outdoor?
This is both.
Both?
Yep, so the micro license can be on ALR land, it can be anywhere, and I'll show you, I will get to those questions.
Okay.
So basically, these are the required micro license application information. You need security clearances, you need a site, you need a facility, and you need facility clearance. These are the type of zonings that are appropriate for micro cultivation, not necessarily the macro cultivation. So residential plus 4 acres is appropriate. Basically, this is basically where it already exists. So it already exists on residential, and most people have built a car shed. Some of them have done so with municipal permitting and said it was a car garage. Some of them have just built facilities without any municipal permitting and run a micro grow in their yard, and some of them are under MMAR, some of them are under ACMPR, and basically all of these small scale production are what we see in our communities now. The macro productions and the processing, the larger processors have only been very recently allowed and have bought up, it's the same as Labatt's or any of the large breweries, where you buy up massive pieces of land, you lobby for it to get municipal approval, and you open up these massive facilities that all have the same problems as mass agriculture or mono agriculture, and also take up a lot of land use. The micros are appropriate for small scale industrial. They can be indoor facilities. They can also be grown in large greenhouses. The issue with the large greenhouses, or with a greenhouse nowadays, is that before it had to be grown in soil on ALR land, there was a stipulation that there was no greenhouse growing, no cement added to ALR land. And now the regulations are a little bit more unclear as to whether you can build a greenhouse, because cannabis has been declared an agricultural product. So it can be grown in a way that a farmer feels fit for it to be grown. And with the microbe, the testing from Health Canada, which is why we're legalized, is so that we can have safe regulatory process. Cannabis has to go to Health Canada to be tested for 5 different products plus microbes. So any of the fertilizer that goes on has to be prescribed by Health Canada, as well as the microbe count, which makes it extremely difficult to grow in soil because the microbe count is very prohibitive. Health Canada's regulatory and licensing includes all of these things, the facility inspection, all the way to the sharing of information with the provincial and federal authorities. Municipal services for micro licenses, they're basically the same as any other agricultural product. Water use is similar. It takes about 300 gallons a week, pretty much, to cultivate cannabis, but with new facilities, people are growing hydroponically, and they're using recycling of their water. So using agricultural science, basically the municipal use of things from water to waste have all been done in a full circle economy. Electricity use is another one of the major issues with, they have to basically have 3-phase power in order to have the lights operating, but same thing, LED lights and other ways that people can grow in innovative ways have reduced the amount of electricity as well. Waste is compostable organic matter, and fungicides, pesticides, and herbicides are strictly regulated. So the waste product can just be composted. Micro licenses will not look like this. They will look more like this. This is a small inside of a micro grow. District of Squamish bylaw for cultivation. Squamish has always been on the forefront of cannabis regulations. A year before our regulatory process, we brought up the fact that licensing for dispensaries was going to be coming up north because Vancouver had a $30,000 licensing fee, and we saw quite a few applications coming to Squamish for dispensaries. So we've thought a lot about the dispensary economy. When I was on council, I didn't think about the cultivation economy. I didn't think about the vertically integrated economy and all the products and ancillary businesses around the cannabis economy. With all these setbacks, you've basically restricted your cultivation to one facility, maybe in the business park. But if you included all the facilities that were already in existence, you have zero opportunity for cultivation. Outdoor mitigation and municipal services. This is a list of the odor mitigation, which is one of the major factors for the public to be concerned with cannabis, is odor. But Health Canada strictly regulates, and you don't notice the businesses that are already in your community because of odor mitigation that's being done with HVAC systems. Ozone and air ionizers are also utilized to reduce the smell in indoor facilities. So these facilities are already next to homes, they're already next to businesses. There's a ton of them in the business park, and we don't really notice because the odor has been mitigated. On the ones that are MMAR, they don't have to be concerned with municipal bylaws, so you get smell and you get the things that the public tends to complain about. The regional district of the Central Kootenay and Nelson, 30 to 60% of their economy is run from the cannabis cultivation industry. Because of that, they've allowed cultivation in rural residential over 4 acres, in remote residential, in agriculture, on industrial, and they have minimal setbacks and restrictions for cultivation. They've basically allowed the economy that already exists, to continue to exist, except under a safer regulatory framework. Direct cannabis business, like cultivation, processing, lab testing, and sales. The economic opportunity is massive for Squamish because we already have the thought in the corridor is that there's 300 to 500 farmers already operating in our corridor. Management, agronomy, the science around agriculture, analytical chemistry is essential for cannabis now because of the Health Canada regulations. Software development has become massive, accounting, security, social media businesses and small businesses. Supply chain logistics and sales are all a part of the economic opportunity that are already blossoming in Squamish. The ancillary businesses like the labs, the health technologies, there's a lot of lawyers in this business. Oddly enough, a lot of lawyers are transitioning into the cannabis economy because of the regulatory framework. The startup economy is absolutely massive. Seed to sale technology, and as the contract support, the amount of building that's going to happen because you have to have an already built facility is also going to be massive. So when I look at cannabis, I look at the vertical economic integration. And for Squamish, the integration of businesses is massive. You already see the economic opportunity scaling in co-working spaces, in people connecting with each other. We have a ton of extraction businesses. The extraction businesses that exist have global products. The edibles products that exist in this community are massive as well, the things that are being put into the economy. The natural healthcare products, we're going to start lobbying for CBD to be entering the market. Meanwhile, the global opportunity has already succeeded Canada. People saw that Canada legalized and thought this is going to be a massive economy. They've already scaled CBD and extraction products and allowed them, and Germany, as well as all of Europe, is looking at legalization very shortly, but they've already got a CBD and extraction economy. CBD is a non-psychogenic part of cannabis, but it does scientifically need THC to transport to have the benefits. So separating it out into molecules doesn't work. It is a full spectrum botanical plant and will hopefully eventually have a natural healthcare product number and be recognized as a natural healthcare product. Rural economic development is massive. We all talk about transitioning our economies off fossil fuel. We talk about transitioning our economies into more natural products and actually having full spectrum and full vertical integration of our small, clean agriculture economy. Cannabis is a great plant, and hemp are great plants. They sequester massive amounts of CO2, more than any other plant. Hemp fibrous plants are an amazing sequestration for CO2. They also are a great intermediary plant to keep the soil, like you plant your regular crops, but as a transition crop, people use hemp as a transition crop, and they plant hemp and then go back to the regular thing. The amount of females represented in agriculture is massive. So it's almost 30% of Canadian farmers are now female. They're more educated than their male counterparts. Their average income is $39,000. And cannabis micro-licenses, allowing a micro-license on a standard ALR property that is already cultivating food, takes an economy that maybe 3 to 4 months a year and allows it to operate full year, 12-month economy. So if you allow a farm plate of say 4,000 to 6,000 square feet on a regular ALR property and maybe have restrictions for size of property, the SLRD is, they went from 50 hectare minimum to 5 hectare minimum, and we're hoping that they transition to 5 acre minimum like the rest of the province. Mark Kleiman said it's multi-dimensional, hard to predict economy, and in Colorado they've had to transition a lot of their regulatory processes. And I want to thank you and open up the opportunity for questions on your zoning and your economy. The one more point I want to add is your ACMPR and MMAR economy right now is where the gray market is getting its wheat from. So the amount, Health Canada has failed to do the plant counts to ensure that the licenses for medical patients are being transitioned only to those medical patients. So we have 5 dispensaries right now in Squamish, and all of that is gray market weed. And we call it gray market weed because we're transitioning away from black market. And also the term marijuana is no longer used because that was quite a culturally restrictive way of speaking about cannabis. It was used to ensure that the Mexican, that it was used in the United States to say that the Mexicans were producing this evil plant and we're calling it marijuana to make it sound Mexican and make sure that the drug war is not only dealing with cannabis, but dealing with immigration. And I'm sure you've all heard of the transitioning of like the amount of people that are in jail and how culturally inappropriate it is.
Thank you very much. Council, I can't imagine there are any questions or comments. Councillor Anderson.
Susan Chapelle, you've given us an industry perspective here, and it's very welcome. I'm wondering whether there is a regional industry organization, and the reason why I'm interested is that Council has discussed the cannabis industry, known as production, recently in connection with land use planning and zoning. The focus of our discussion thus far on that occasion recently was macro, rather than that I would say the micro industry that you described. Why I think it would be interesting to hear from or have a dialogue with regional industry organizations, I for one would like to know more about your location requirements, in particular for macro. Our discussion, as you may know, focused on competition with other land uses. We also touched on servicing requirements. And I know that the municipalities in the Lower Mainland had very similar circumstances. We're in dialogue with our Economic Development Department on competition for land. So this is my question. What do you see in the way of an organization for continued dialogue on that?
Thank you. That's a great question. It's, as a new legal industry, there are all sorts of new jobs that are opening up, like Director of Government Relations. We've never had these jobs in the cannabis industry. Lobbyists, we've never been able to be openly lobbying municipalities or even discussing cannabis economy. So and looking at macro, they use quite an extensive amount of land as well as an extensive amount of power and resources. That's why we tend to talk about in the craft economy and the existing economy, we tend to talk about more celebrating the craft economy. And for Squamish, the craft economy is flourishing. You have craft beer, you have craft spirits, you have this entirely massive economy that's generating a huge amount of tourism and a huge amount of outside interest. Last week you passed a TUP for having events at Backcountry Beer. I think this is amazing integration, and that council is doing a great job of actually having discussions around the craft economy. But how do we open up zoning when you have setback restrictions around so many different, that some of them are essential, like schools and municipal buildings, but smoking bylaws are essential as well, and public health and safety is essential. But craft cannabis in a small canopy fits perfectly with the didactic of your economic development strategy. Craft cannabis is in a small footprint. You can have multiples on the same footprint because they're so small. So if you had an industrial piece of land, you could open up a multitude of craft micro cannabis producers. But also the things that I worry about is having transportation all over the place. There's a lot of municipal parks opening. They're called green parks. In California, this is quite a normal thing, where they have extraction, packaging, transportation, cultivation, all on one footprint. So you're not having trucks transporting cannabis, and it reduces its climate footprint, basically. Also, the amount of taxation that you can gather from having multiple ancillary businesses in one spot, as well as allowing security businesses, software development tools, all in one area, as well as labs. Lab testing is going to be critically important, and you're going to see labs appearing in communities that have cannabis. And those labs can test all sorts of things, not just cannabis, but open up entire businesses for labs and testing. So yeah, the macro businesses really do take up a large amount of space. And I can't, looking at the footprint of Squamish, I don't really see that there is a massive amount of space for a macro, but multiple small spaces for small startups and businesses for micros. The largest restriction is a 200-meter setback from other businesses. This 200-meter setback doesn't exist for any other business. It doesn't exist for alcohol. It doesn't exist for tobacco. It doesn't exist, you have tobacco in grocery stores. And one day we're going to see cannabis cigarettes in grocery stores as well. So if we look to the future and we start planning for the future and we allow for opening up of land use for an economy that's already happening, these MMARs and ACMPRs will be hopefully transitioning to appropriate municipal land use. You had a fire, and we've had 2 fires in the ACMPRs and MMARs in Squamish because of having to steal electricity, because of having no inspections. And as we look at this, the land use transitioning into a place where municipal bylaw is actually involved in the creation of these spaces and ensures the safety of the public, they're businesses like all other businesses that are well inspected, well insulated, and have a ton of safety measures in place by all levels of government, and hopefully soon taxation as well.
Thank you. Councillor Pettengill.
So 2 questions, and I'm just not clear with all the regulations changing and so on. These micro growers, can they, whatever micro grow license, can they sell direct to consumers? Can they supply local dispensaries? Do they have to go to a sort of provincial distributor for testing? Like, how does the product flow into the hands of consumers from a micro producer?
That's a really great question, Chris. So a micro producer is the same as a macro producer. They all have to run through a licensed producer. So a licensed producer is somebody that's received a license for distribution, but the licensed producer can sell to the province through I can't remember the exact LCCBC now is the provincial distribution. There are no farm gate sales. You cannot sell directly to a dispensary. It all has to go through testing, through Health Canada testing, through a lab, and then get sold to an LP, and then the LP sells it to the province, and the province sells it to the distributors.
And just a clarification on that then, does that mean these people, they're selling to one another on paper, but it actually gets shipped from the local grower to the local dispensary, or it physically has to be shipped to the province for testing, then to the provincial distributor, and then back locally?
You can have a local lab and the lab testing, as long as it's a licensed lab, can do the Health Canada testing, and they're given a very strict parameters for the herbicides and pesticides. Once they pass that regulatory process, then it can move, after it's totally clean cannabis in a licensed facility, then it can move through a licensed distributor on to the province. And then from the province, it goes into our dispensaries. And we currently don't have any licensed dispensaries. We have two dispensaries that are actually going through the process right now to become provincial dispensaries. But currently, right now, all 5 of our dispensaries are still not licensed dispensaries.
Are there any craft cannabis places operating right now?
No.
So just keep the questions at the table. Are you clarification?
One final
Go ahead.
question, if I can. So, you touched on the non-legal dispensaries. On the one hand, we hear that there are strict regulations that will keep everyone safe and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we hear there's all these operators that have been very comfortable ignoring all the rules and are still doing so. So, is it worth our effort to come up with bylaws and changes and enforcement when, quite frankly, the industry quite largely has demonstrated if rules don't suit them, they will ignore them. So is it, why would we bother?
You're now in municipal politics. You know that regulatory change takes a long time. It's only been 8 months. So the licenses haven't happened yet. People have been applying for licenses, and now you see that Health Canada has actually changed the regulations. They had 70 applications that didn't make it through regulatory process because they didn't have municipal zoning. So municipalities have not opened up the land use to allow micros to actually happen in their districts. Some municipalities are completely prohibition. Some have celebrated the craft economy and have opened up their zoning. And in those regions, you're seeing micros being built appropriately and those licenses going to Health Canada. But the license process of applying for a license and having a quality assurance personnel and all of your ducks in the row, applying for a license and then having it reviewed by Health Canada, and then you have to produce a crop. That crop has to actually be put in the garbage, basically. That's going to be another problem. That crop will probably end up in the gray market as well. But the one crop that you have to produce to prove that you can produce a crop that is regulatory, that is gone through regulatory process and tested for safety. And then you can start producing crops. So this is a very long process. And in a new regulatory industry, the regulations that notice the craft economy are going to take a long time. They're going to take the same long time that wine and beer took. And still, wine and beer are still lobbying for fair taxation, still lobbying for fair land use, and we still have zoning restrictions and can't allow even our craft alcohol to thrive in Squamish because we have restricted zoning practices. So in Squamish, really allowing for appropriate land use for the economy that already exists, instead of ignoring the economy and saying it's going to be in the gray market. If you say it's going to be in the gray market and don't allow for land use, it will stay in the gray market. People will always find a way to produce for their patients and for their consumers. So basically allowing the best opportunity for those small growers to become legalized is by opening up your zoning and regulating it so that there is no reason for them to be in the illegal economy. And I know that there are craft growers in Squamish right now going through the entire process, and it will take them a long time. And in the meantime, they will probably be producing crops because they have patients and licenses that they have to supply. And as we know, the cancer, the benefits to cancer patients in this economy, we used to have cancer patients driving down the highway before we had dispensaries. And thank goodness this council was brave enough to actually regulate dispensaries and allow for that. So now, and the largest demographic of cannabis users is going to be senior citizens.
One more question, Councillor Stone.
I just have a clarifying question. You said that there were estimated 300,000 users in the corridor.
Yes.
How many of those are in the district of Squamish? Do you know? Estimate?
No, we don't know. And also there's been no process. We've passed laws without including the farmers. So because it's been in the gray market, there's been no opportunity for feedback from the farmers or an actual municipal engagement process. I think it would be an amazing thing to see Squamish lead an engagement process with the farmers and find out what is the actual economy like here, because it's all speculation. There's no rural economic idea about how big this economy is, except for in Nelson when it became legalized, all the businesses started going downhill because the economy basically started tanking.
And then just want to flag two things. Thank you for the presentation. As you are probably aware, we're going through a zoning bylaw update for 2020. I don't know if on that long list of 140 something things to look at, what is on there is a review of the business park regulations and zoning. And so this definitely falls into that conversation. So I hope we'll continue to be involved there. And then the other thing I want to flag is that a handful of us councillors were at the Lower Mainland Local Government Association conference last week, and I just want to flag that there was a resolution passed. So there was a fair bit of concern within across different communities about the impact that this is having on ALR land, and the trade-off recognizing that farmers are benefiting from supplementing their income with higher priced crop, but also the impact that's having on food security. So there was a resolution passed that says, therefore be it resolved that the provincial government be requested to establish a cap on the number of licenses issued for cannabis facilities and agricultural communities in order to protect food security in British Columbia. So just so you're aware, that is also a conversation that's going on.
That's a really great point, and to that point that our farmers are suffering in a lot of different ways because of globalization. So the cranberry farmers have hundreds of acres of cranberries. They have small outbuildings on their cranberry farms that they'd like to turn to cannabis cultivation. China opened up cranberry farming, and it was like 13,000 hectares of cranberry farming, and it's been competing with our cranberry farmers. And as food globalizes and farming globalizes, we have to look at what our land is actually good to cultivate. We are great at root vegetables, everything else is indoors. And to actually say that the northern part of Canada is a great place to cultivate, it's not. It needs, and if hemp and cannabis becomes an economy here that supplements our farmers in a good way, they should be allowed to have micros. I totally agree with restricting macros on ALR land. I don't think it should be, I think it should be a supplementation. But to say yes or no for ALR land and restricting licenses is not fair to the farmers. The farmers need to be involved in the conversation. But to say you have to grow 70% carrots and 30% is allowed for cannabis seems like a more reasonable way to allow farmers to be able to have a 12-month economy in an environment that is not so friendly to farming.
And I just want to get the last word to Jonas.
If I just may ask for clarification, Nelson was mentioned a few times. My understanding is that actually the municipality of Nelson does not permit cultivation. It's the regional district, or the Central Kootenay Regional District.
So, yeah, that's a great point. They don't have any land in Nelson, so they allow it in industrial. But the regional district surrounds all of Nelson like it does in Squamish, and the regional district has completely opened up cannabis farming. So Nelson itself is also in the middle of a revision of the bylaws to open it up. So previously they did prohibit it, and they no longer prohibit it.
Just my understanding was that they still prohibit it. I'm not sure if they're working
They actually
on it.
elected cannabis advocates to council because it was such a concern for their economy. So they're in the middle of rewriting bylaws and going through the process right now. Thank you, that's my question too.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to call this. This is a conversation to go on, I think, for a little bit if we let it, but we don't have the time this morning. But thank you very much for coming. And I think this is just generally my comment is that this is, I think, going to be one of these things that will be trial and error for a few years. And so we'll just have to keep, I guess the approach is to stay flexible.
Thank you so much, Councillor Reyes. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good council.
What place is downtown you're going right now, so it's not downtown?
So,
Yeah.
you could carry on that conversation outside, please. We've got another item on the agenda. Last is wildlife habitat and connectivity.
Should I go? Are you ready? Do I introduce myself?
Can I hand it over to Ms. McJannet and she can introduce the topic?
Got it, sorry. Thanks so much, Council. Good morning. I'd like to introduce Joe Gorton, who has presented a delegation request to Council and a letter. And so there's been a number of letters, I think, that have been batched together. And so staff have met with Joe and others. And so Joe's going to lead with some discussion, and then we have staff have a follow-up, just a couple of slides to provide some context for the conversation, and then we can go forward.
Okay, and just so you know, we have another meeting scheduled to start at 10:30. We have a little bit of flexibility with that meeting, but I have to start it at some point, legislative requirements for notice and so forth. So we'll start this. I would like to leave some time for council to have comments and questions, but I'd like to try to wrap up 22, quarter to. We've gone a little over time with some of the other things, so we'll go a little over time with yours as well.
I timed myself, I'm like 4 minutes and 30 seconds, so I think I'll be quick. Hi everyone, my name is Joe Gorton. I am a Squamish resident. I moved here about 3 years ago from Vancouver, but I grew up in northern BC. I'm a nurse practitioner actually. I'm not a habitat conservation specialist, although I appreciate the title given to me by the chief. I am, however, passionate about habitat conservation and any concrete and effective action local government can take to mitigate the effects of climate change, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I just wanted to begin by drawing attention to the recently released House Sound Cumulative Effects Assessment, which I'm sure some of you read, which noted threats to critical species and habitat due to the human impacts on the environment. Specifically, the assessment shows mixed conditions for grizzly bear, elk, and marmot populations in the corridor and uses these species as a broader indication for overall wildlife health. Of course, this is in keeping with the recent UN Global Assessment Report, which I'm sure many of you saw in the news, looking at how natural ecosystems have lost about half of their preceding land in decades, in the last about 30 years, and that 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction, all largely as a result of human actions. I just want to point out the obvious, that the health of ecosystems, which we and other species depend, is foundational to our economies, our livelihoods, our food and water security, and as well as our overall quality of life, especially here in Squamish. So I believe that Council has a role to play in preserving critical habitat. In fact, the residents of Squamish has identified this as a priority for you. I won't repeat our email, but I want to reiterate the OCP objective to, quote, establish, maintain, and enhance habitat connectivity and greenway corridors for wildlife movement, end quote. For those of you who are not aware, ecological corridors allow wildlife to move between natural areas and are essential to prevent habitat fragmentation. And through conversations with your staff, which I believe they're going to speak to in a minute, I have come to understand that we actually have very limited formal knowledge of wildlife corridors. And this includes land slated for immediate and future development. I also noted that I think district staff again will speak to this, but the need to start approaching the issue regionally instead of on a piecemeal by piecemeal basis. I wanted to speak a little bit about the advantage of doing this now and doing it in Squamish. Firstly, unlike many, many areas in Canada, we are not dealing necessarily with fragmented habitats. So in Squamish, it's a lot about protection of existing or what we believe to be corridors, rather than trying to build overpasses and connecting habitat that's already fragmented. So we have a pretty unique opportunity to do it in a really low cost effective way. I also wanted to point out that there is considerable local expertise in the area. I have heard from many people since that letter in January. And actually we put together a little map, which I can hand out, based on just a lot of experience with the Trail Society and the Environment Society of areas where we think the corridors are likely to be. I also want to note recent federal government closures in the Peace region, where I grew up, in the backcountry there, due to the protection of species at risk there. And we all know that Squamish is also at risk for these federal backcountry closures if we don't have thriving species in critical habitat. A couple other things that we can maybe speak to later. There's a precedence for using volunteers in the region with the eagle count, and I think that's an interesting opportunity. Again, I think there's a lot of local interest and expertise that's available for consulting. We have some wildlife biologists who have worked all over Canada in town. I think there's some interesting opportunities for collaboration with the provincial government, and I noted last week that the federal government announced a lot of new funding to protect critical habitat, so I would be interested in looking at that.
Yeah, so generally our approach would be to start with the low-hanging fruit. We've developed these maps based on a lot of different conversations with people in the community. And so I would urge you to commit resources to studying these and potentially the broader region and upcoming 2020 budget. And in the meantime, this might be a reach, but given the potential length of how long it takes to study some of these corridors, I would urge you to consider a bylaw requiring that large developments on previously uninhabited land need to assess for potential wildlife corridors and conserve and/or enhance these. Again, while this may seem bold, this will bring major long-term cost savings to the region, primarily it costs the district actually only time, and importantly be the most courageous step that is required to protect all the critical habitat that we have here. Thank you. Was that fast?
Thank you. So, turn it over to staff.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you, Joe, and to the Environment Society for bringing forward these interests and concerns and basically a call to action. And so when Joe's letter originally came in, Mayor Elliott asked staff to connect in with Joe, so we took the opportunity to meet with Joe to discuss her letter and also to do a little bit of a scan. We hosted a number of other conversations with the province and some other researchers that are doing wildlife work in this area. And so for council, we just wanted to provide a little bit of policy context for wildlife corridors, so there's a common understanding of how wildlife corridors are treated in the official community plan. And then Caroline also would like to add some information and highlight some of the work around the environmentally sensitive areas work that happened preceding the OCP that informed it, and some considerations around wildlife corridors that we've been having internally for a few years. And then moving forward, talk about some of the opportunities I think that might exist for us in the future. So I've just got a couple of, I have 2 slides. Let me just open it up here. That's Turtle Trail. Turtles, cannabis, and corridors. Okay, so there's a lot going on this slide, but basically what we wanted to highlight for council is that through the OCP update, environmental protection and enhancement and wildlife corridors was a very high priority that was expressed by the community. We had existing wildlife corridor policy in our old OCP that we brought forward and augmented. The 2 big key objectives that we set through the OCP under a subchapter or a subsection called wildlife corridors and managing attractants. The 2 key objectives that were set were to enhance natural habitat connectivity and corridors for wildlife movement, and then secondly around a second objective around minimizing attractants to reduce wildlife conflict within the community. And so the policies that followed with that in section 10 were to work with all levels of government, First Nations, and the community to ultimately define and establish wildlife habitats and corridors, and to protect those corridors during land use planning and development, and to pursue opportunities to try and restore fragmented areas and reconnect corridors and natural areas for movement. The way that we can do that and advance that policy, there's a couple of things that are sitting within the community plan that we'll highlight for council, and then I'll turn to Caroline for more information. But essentially in the community plan, through our sub-area plan policy, so for sub-area level planning, we do have criteria set that requires for sub-area plans inventory of environmentally sensitive areas and wildlife habitats, and identification and measures to protect significant contiguous areas for protection. So that's sitting within that. There's a long sort of list of criteria for sub-area planning. So wildlife corridors are sitting as a requirement to be looked at and considered through sub-area planning. And then also the other tool that we have is through our environmental development protection area. So we inserted an objective around supporting species movement and connecting ecosystems through corridors, as well as guidelines and measures. And so those are sitting within our environmental protection development permit area. Keep in mind that sub-area planning, neighborhood planning, and then this environmental review at
through our environmental DPA, that's all happening at a more site-specific level. And so what we're grappling with are corridors that are more at the landscape and regional level, and that's sort of the missing piece here. So I'm going to turn it to Caroline to just briefly touch on how we got to the ESA work and whatnot. Great.
Okay, can I just, before you do that, can I just clarify with Joe's point that if there was a large...
Yes, you may.
I apologize for looking the wrong way. Joe's point at the end, if there's a large development, just to pick up on what you're saying there, if there's a large development that there already is policy that requires them to look at on a site-specific basis what the wildlife corridors are through the DPA and through the reports their qualified environmental professional would produce.
That's correct, and I think that that being said, there's still, it is tricky to look at that at a site level, even a sub-area plan level, without being mindful of the bigger picture, and I think that's what we're moving towards, is that bigger picture view. And there is work that's underway around this, and we'll talk to that briefly, but firstly, over to Caroline.
Thanks, Sarah. So Caroline Ashekian, professional biologist and environmental coordinator with the district. A great deal of work went into informing our environmentally sensitive areas mapping. This work was a multi-year project which spanned around 3 years preceding the adoption of the OCP. This work, first there was scoping and a gap analysis to understand what we know and what information we need. And then we conducted a bioterrain and terrestrial ecosystem mapping analysis of the district, and that's based on provincial methodology. And that also included a wetland inventory and a marine shoreline inventory. And from there, we developed a sensitive ecosystem inventory. The next phase of the project was watercourse mapping, and then further to that, detailed watercourse mapping on district lands. So all this work put together led us to develop our sensitive ecosystem inventory, which helped develop our environmental protection development permit area guidelines and mapping in the OCP. Which is significantly more robust than what was in the previous OCP. So this was based on what we heard from the public and from council. Consideration was given to wildlife corridors, and wildlife corridors were intentionally decoupled from the scope of the environmentally sensitive areas mapping due to the scope and budget of what it would take to actually map wildlife corridors throughout our district on a regional basis.
Thanks, Caroline. And so further to that, my understanding too, in talking with staff internally, is that work was sort of decoupled at that time, but also set out as a future intention, and also that showed up through the policy in the OCP. Just very briefly, some of the additional work and conversations that we hosted. So we met with the province, with Lynn Roard and a senior biologist there, to better understand what work, if any, is happening around wildlife corridors within our larger regional area. And so there's bits and pieces of data and mapping that has been done. Some of that was mentioned by Joe in terms of the provincial cumulative effects framework for the Howe Sound region. And so there are a number of species and values, so grizzly and Roosevelt elk and murrelet and marbled murrelet and other species in terms of corridor work. So there's some data, but it is focused on those species. And also we understood and serendipitously heard about a Quest researcher, Dr. Kimberly Daw, who's doing and initiating a 3-year study at this time in the Shannon Basin, looking at wildlife corridors and using remote sensing wildlife cameras and working in that zone within the district. Well, it sort of bridges district, but mostly in the SLRD in the Shannon Basin, to look at the impacts of recreation and visitor use in that basin on wildlife and displacement, etc. There's also work historically that was done for the Sea to Sky LRMP, the Land and Resource Management Plan, that was done with Squamish Nation and other First Nations to look at wildlife areas important for wildlife historically and incorporating that Indigenous knowledge as well. So there's a lot of different work that's happened and stuff that's emerging as well. So it would be good as a future opportunity to connect in, because when we're looking at wildlife corridors beyond kind of the formal district boundary, we do need to have the province at the table, First Nations, and also there's a great opportunity to align, we think, with other work that's already happening. So for example, in meeting with Kimberly Dahl last week, she's also in conversation about other wildlife monitoring stations. She has the benefit also, she's a teacher at Quest, and so she's working with her students up there and has a lot of student power to go out and track down all the footage and do all the analysis. In any event, so with those future opportunities, we would need to basically scope out wildlife corridor assessment work to take action or advance any of this work around wildlife corridors. Joe mentioned sort of that the timing is urgent, and well, I think the reality is that this kind of work, it's not a 6-month project, it's usually longer term, multi-year project for data collection. And so for future considerations, I think I have another slide here, sorry. That's sort of the present conversation. But I think the reality for Squamish too is that we have ongoing development, increasing surge of visitation in the corridor, and also that there's neighborhood scale and sub-area planning that is ongoing and will be initiated for future growth areas as well. So there's an opportunity to look at wildlife corridors through the sub-area planning, but there's also a need to consider this more regionally as well. So with that in mind, if council is interested in having staff take a look at that for future budget years, we can have that conversation.
Thank you. I guess one of the questions that comes to me, as far as decisions that we make at this table, we have a growth management boundary where presumably, at least in the near term, we are going to be seeing the growth confined to that area, densification of existing development areas, etc. And then, of course, outside that, there's basically a lot of it is almost untouched forest, and so understandably home for habitat. But within the growth management boundary, which is where I think most of our land use decisions will be focused for the next how many years, what types of corridor decisions are we looking at? I mean, we're talking about significantly developed areas already. In some cases, you might argue you wouldn't want the wildlife coming to a neighborhood, and you would discourage it rather than do something else. So can you comment on that? Is it going to, how far is it going to impact our decisions within the growth management boundary?
Yeah, I looked at the Adventure Center last week. I think it was nice for our photo, but not great for them. I agree. I think there's some talk, and again, I'm not a total expert. I'm a good communicator, so I've managed to get a lot of ideas into this letter. But I think there's a few, like in a really dense area, like for example, Smokeless Park to Dentville along the Britannia Slough, there was some ideas about fencing and just making sure there are corridors across, because we are getting high risk, like the elk populations trying to get through town, and they can right now. So just ensuring there's some downtown like specific areas, but I agree that a lot of the, the Memquam down to like Squamish, that's a huge area and is largely intact right now. But there was a couple smaller but critical areas downtown that are okay right now, but probably need a bit of preservation and maybe a bit of fencing.
Chris?
Given the expertise in the community and the various societies in which we have CAPU and Quest, is this the sort of project where it might make more sense for us to look at granting, sharing providing funding to the schools and or community groups as opposed to staff doing this one in-house? Or this sort of thing in-house?
Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous opportunity to involve community, academia, and local groups in this work. And I think that sort of turning it over, I think it would be better to do as a collaboration, frankly. And I think also there would be a lot of staff time still because of the work to integrate with land use planning and work that we've already done to date. So I think there's an opportunity to do more of a collaboration, but it might involve some additional, like local community groups might also have access, I guess, to other funding that maybe we don't, that could add to the pot. So that's something that we could absolutely take a look at.
Okay, I'll go to staff and then Councillor Stoner. Go ahead, Chris.
Just to clarify on that, whether we collaborate with many groups or just run it as a district project, it would be something that would be RFP'd out. It would be run by professionals. It would be placing cameras and doing the data analysis and everything. There's still a considerable amount of staff time, not only to RFP something like that, but to project manage it and to work with the final reports and turn it into policy. And that amount of work actually goes up the more we collaborate, and this would be probably a very collaborative effort.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation and continued advocacy on this really important file. I'm really pleased to hear the work that we have done to date through the OCP, as well as what we have in place policy-wise for the sub-area plan. It was good to have that clarification. On the broader scope of this, though, I am really hesitant to put the district forward as a lead in this sort of project, just because of where our actual jurisdiction is with regards to making decisions. As Councillor Race noted, that we have focused our development into the growth management boundary, and I think it's really important for us to be informed about what impact that might have on connectivity as we continue to develop that. But this is a regional issue. We can't do it ourselves, and I really don't necessarily think that the district is responsible for leading it. We do have a few folks from the province sitting in the back of the room if they want to come up and sit at the table. Whether it's the province and or the regional district, the reality is like we only can reach so far. And so to then take that on and lead that is a little bit of a disconnect there, because at the end of the day, we're not necessarily the final decision makers on a lot of this. And so I am really excited to see the amount of momentum and expertise within the community. I think we do have really receptive council and staff to this issue, but necessarily being the lead on doing the data collection and analysis, I'd be really hesitant to put the district in that position.
And so who would you propose to that?
I'm sorry?
So who would you propose? Sorry, am I allowed to speak?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering then, who would you suggest that we lobby?
I would suggest that we, and we can collectively do this, I questioned it to Councillor Race if this has come up at the regional district at all.
Right.
And start that conversation with the broader set of decision makers there, and then also the province. The cumulative effect study is a really great first step, and my question back on that particular project is if they have mapped corridors for those 3 specific species that identify any areas within the district of Squamish, then let's start to incorporate those into our mapping. But I'd say the district and the regional district are our primary targets there for leading.
I appreciate that view. I guess sometimes I just get a little concerned because it's easy to like be near a corridor and feel excited to see elk at the adventure center or see the otters downtown yesterday. Like that's great, and people feel excited to have that habitat in town. And so I understand that it has to be this multi-level collaboration, but then I feel like if no one's responsible or taking the lead, it can just get lost. And so I would be excited to see Squamish as a town, and I don't understand fully the boundaries here, but to at least work with us to advocate to other levels of government and make sure that you're at the table and paying attention to this.
And I'll just comment on because I'm also on the regional district board, and so The regional district has a limited amount of planning authority within the boundaries of the District of Squamish, and primarily it's through the regional growth strategy. And so if a significant development was coming either inside or outside of the municipality of Squamish, the regional district board gets to weigh in sort of at a higher level about whether it's appropriate and what impacts it might have, and could, if they chose to, start talking about wildlife corridors and the effect and so forth. Frankly, in the time I've been on the board, that issue has not come up because we have not faced a big development like that.
Okay.
Something like a Garibaldi at Squamish, for example, would raise all kinds of questions around something like that, but that has not come to the board yet. Within Squamish, my personal view is the growth management boundary, as I said, is going to focus our development, at least for the next few years, our development interest. And as staff have said, presently our policy does support consideration of wildlife corridors in sensitive areas when we're dealing with issues within that growth management boundary. Going outside of that growth management boundary, basically, to put it simply, you're into forest. And so that will raise a lot of other issues. We don't have anything planned for that, but if that ever comes up as a possibility, the public, I'm sure, would be aware of it, and absolutely that would be something, to be consistent with our OCP and our present policy, it would be something we would have to consider.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Susan.
Just to expand on the conversation around and the considerations that Joe and others have brought forward around a lot of these kind of key east-west areas, it's interesting to think about the opportunity to, through the neighborhood and the sub-area planning, to look at corridors and movements and information that we can gather through that work, but also to try and stitch it together with more broad regional information where possible. So it's not clear to us at this point, you know, the cumulative effects work, for example, was just recently released, and then there's more data coming. But I think that, you know, to better understand the opportunities to sort of stitch this information together and figure out kind of what we can do to sort of advance on this, and through more of a shared leadership opportunity. So maybe not, you know, leading the charge, but there's always, same thing with the marine strategy, there's many levels of government and community and non-governmental organizations as well interested in this work, and it's just about how can we come together to sort some of this stuff out, all within our areas of influence and jurisdiction. So that's always the trickier part. But if council would like us to kind of continue a conversation and do some work around kind of future understanding and scoping, we can look at that. Or, you know, I guess we're looking to council to sort of gauge, is this something that you'd like staff to investigate a little bit further, or sort of sit with our existing policy and leave it at that.
So I have Councillor Herford, Councillor Benton.
Thank you. Joe, thank you so much for continuing the conversation with this. It's very important, and I appreciate the background of all the pieces that we, policy that's sort of overlapping to this or similar areas. And I agree that regionally we need to have, we don't have the jurisdiction for all the pieces, but I think where there's little victories that are going to add up, we have been looking at that, I feel. But I'm curious to understand better the scope of the work needed to really get to whatever the final policy would look like. And I know at budget time there's a lot of hard decisions, so whether we keep sort of going at it from the little pieces that we can figure out as we go through our micro planning, or whether we have the resources to do the broader scope without a bit of scoping work and better inform us at the budget time. Because when we hear it's big, what is that? So I think at the minimum having a better understanding of what that scope could look like, and potentially an all-in and a service we could see which level we can go to, what that really means. But I also, scoping the scope, I don't know how much time and resources we spend on figuring that out. So, but I do think it's a very important discussion, and supportive of it, but I'm hesitant of the budget and echo Councillor Stoner's concern with sort of stuff that others, other members of government aren't necessarily looking after, so we step up, but I also don't want to have big, everyone stand off as the giant fireball that just drops on the ground and we're all standing there because no one's really taking it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to be participating in the discussion and understand the scope better before we can really move.
Can I add just a small point? Is,
Yeah,
and part of the reason we wanted to put this like initial survey with all the people who came together, I was like, this is what I see, this is what I see. So there are some like low-hanging fruit that are like in town. And so I would also suggest that because that's in your growth area and we have a lot of community information on what animals are seen there, and some of them are species at risk, that maybe you like focus there. And then for the broader regional discussions, maybe because it's expensive and long, and it depends, you're right, are you gonna like look at every beetle? Or are you looking like primarily species at risk and critical habitat? And so that's a regional issue that I think we can move to for our collaboration, but there are like within city limits, things that should happen relatively quickly. And so I would advocate for prioritizing those.
Councillor Pepperell. And then once again, I'm going to try to wrap this up.
Oh, sorry.
So a similar question, circling back, I'm just trying to wrap my head around, when we talk about RFPs and all of that, can we not sort of, are there not people in town that have a good understanding already of where the bears are, and where they are? So some big pieces of that really low-hanging fruit, we don't need all of this, so we get that information sort of fairly quickly, and then what we decide as a district to do with that information as a policy, that's when we start getting more engaged and there's more effort. But it seems like there are some of those initial pieces which would be valuable, which wouldn't be huge on our part necessarily from a good facility. Or is there sort of something I'm missing here?
Through the chair, I think that's a great first step, and what I could see as basically hosting some more conversation and trying to figure out what are those pieces, and to take a look at the initial map that Joe has. We haven't seen that yet, so we just to have some further discussion around some initial kind of next steps that would make sense around this, and then bring that back to council to highlight what could this look like, what sort of a kind of a low, medium, and high kind of resource, like different options, what it could look like. Also, there's lots of community examples. Mr. Buxton is coming from the Canmore context, and during his tenure there, went through, a very intensive planning around wildlife corridors. So he brings that experience, that firsthand experience from that community as well. And I think there's others that can provide insight and guidance to us in terms of different approaches that we might be able to take. But I'm interested to learn more and have further conversation with the community and with Joe just around some of those low-hanging fruit pieces. So maybe we can commit to council to bring back an update for future budget consideration around scoping.
Thank you. So, and just a final comment, I'll speak for myself that within the growth management boundary, you've heard about our existing policy, and I would expect staff to apply that lens to any development within the growth management boundary, any redevelopment of an existing area, etc., to see what opportunities there are and what needs there are. So absolutely communicate your priorities to staff, because staff are free on their own initiative to bring it to council, separate from new development. And going outside, that becomes a bigger project, obviously. And it may be that, I'll just leave it to staff to think about this, they may want to just consider some high-level thought about that, but not get too specific until we actually are faced with a development of one of those areas, in which case, in some cases, it could be funded by the developer. If they're going to go into a district lot that's not developed right now, okay, this is what we want looked at. So there are opportunities to do that as long as we sort of have that focus for the future. So I'll leave it to staff to kind of come with that. I don't think, do you need a resolution of any sort? No. So I think we'll just wait for that to come back. But absolutely stay in touch with our staff on those points. You can always use that information.
Okay, I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for coming in. So that completes this. Before I recess, I want a motion to terminate this meeting. Moved by Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, it's
Second by Councillor Rupert. All in favor? Carried.